The earth cracked open beneath the baobab tree in the village of Umuziwaki. On the night the moon bled, and from that wound in the soil came not screams, but silence, as if the land itself held its breath while the grave gave birth to a girl swaddled in crimson. Dust and shadows. The old women gathered with cowrie shell eyes and whispered of omens long buried. For none had forgotten the tale of Mancheba, the grandmother who once danced with time itself, stealing the years of her children to preserve her beauty with a carved from bone and bound with the hair of her firstborn. And now that same had been lost for 3 generations, hidden by fire, swallowed by sand. Or so they believed until the child with no cry and no past opened her black eyes in the graveyard and stared into the soul of Gogo Wandel, the last living daughter of Mancheba, who clutched her chest as a forgotten chill slithered down her spine. And the spirits whispered, "She has returned." For the infant bore the same birthmark in ink-black spiral beneath her ear, the mark of those touched by the comb's curse. And though Gogol Wandel tried to turn away, her legs rooted like ancient bark, unable to flee as the girl reached out with a hand so small yet filled with the weight of centuries. And when their skin met, the wind howled through the branches as unseen ancestors stirred in their slumber, moaning through the leaves, and the night wrapped tighter around the village like a snake around a sleeping bird. For in that single moment, Gogo knew the silence was not peace, it was a warning. Gogol Wandel staggered backward from the grave's edge, her breath shallow and bones aching as the infant nestled in the dust began to whimper a thin, eerie sound more like wind threading through a flute carved from sorrow than a baby's cry. And though every instinct told her to run, she knelt instead, her knees sinking into the cracked earth as memories of her mother Mancheba flooded her. Memories thick with incense, ritual chants, and forbidden mirrors that aged and shattered when stared into too long. She reached trembling fingers toward the child again, this time not from fear, but from a dreadful knowing that she could not leave this one behind. For the ancestors had placed her back into the world for a reason, and to ignore it would be to court a deeper curse. So she scooped the child into her arms, surprised by the sudden warmth of her skin, as if the grave had not birthed death but fire wrapped in flesh. And as the village winds shifted and whispered through the reeds, the child ceased her wailing and pressed her tiny cheek against Gogo's chest, sighing like one who had waited too long to return home. In the distance, the hyenas stopped laughing, and a silence fell over Umuziwaki that was too heavy to be nights doing alone, one that settled in the bones of every elder and stirred uneasy dreams in the youth, for all knew, without knowing why, that something had awakened beneath their feet, something old and watching. The next morning, Gogol Wandel wrapped the child in goat skin cloth and walked the long path to the river, past huts of red clay and straw where women pounded millet and men carved drums, each pausing to stare as she passed, no one daring to speak, though many crossed themselves with fingers dipped in ash or whispered the names of long dead warriors under their breath. At the river bank, Gogo knelt and bathed the girl with slow reverence, letting the currents carry away the red dust of the grave. But as the water touched the birthmark behind the girl's ear, the river surged unnaturally, a great wave rising from its stillness to crash against the banks, soaking them both. And as Gogo gasped, she saw something caught in the reeds, a glint of ivory bone entwined with black hair, unmistakable and cursed. The Mancheba had once used to steal time itself. It pulsed faintly with a rhythm that echoed the girl's heartbeat, and though every fiber in Gogo's being screamed to leave it be, her hand reached out, as if compelled by the spirits that walked beside her unseen, and the moment her fingers brushed it, a whisper slid through the wind. Her silence is not emptiness, it is remembering. And in that instant, Gogo knew the girl was not just born of silence, she was its voice. Gogo Wandel stood frozen at the river's edge, the trembling in her palm like a living thing, its bone handle slick with river mist and dread, while the child in her arms blinked slowly, unbothered by the rising wind or the darkened water that now hissed like a cauldron beneath them. It was then that Gogo heard the drumming not from the village, but from beneath the earth, a slow, pulsing beat that matched the rhythm of the unstirred echoes in her bloodline, old rhythms known only to those born of Mancheba's line, rhythms buried when the ancestors sealed away the rites of youth feeding and memory draining. And as the sound deepened, the trees near the river bent inward as if bowing toward the girl, their leaves whispering secrets in a forgotten tongue. And Gogo, heart clenched like a fist, turned and hurried back through the winding path to her hut, the wrapped hastily in goat hide, her mind swirling with warnings from dreams she once cast aside, visions of shadowed children with hollow eyes, voices lost to time, and always that comb, that cursed, precious thing that fed on years and left silence in its wake. Inside the hut, smoke curled from a clay pot filled with burning mfefo, and as Gogo laid the baby on a reed mat and placed it on the altar her mother had built decades ago, she saw how the girl's gaze followed the object, not with fear or innocence but recognition, as though she remembered its weight in her tiny hands across 100 lifetimes. That night, sleep would not come, and the air in Umuziwaki felt thick, as though the ancestors themselves held their breath. And when the first rooster cried, Gogo took the child to the Asangoma of the hills, Mamzithu, keeper of the ancestral tongue and the only one left who had spoken to the spirits directly. Since the day of the skyfire storm, Mamzithu stood outside her hut, blind eyes milky yet piercing, and said before Gogo could utter a word, "You bring me a child of the grave and the voice of the void." And she beckoned them inside with fingers covered in ochre and ash. The Asangoma took no time with pleasantries, instead crushing black roots into a paste and smearing it on the baby's forehead, while chanting in syllables that bent the air. And as she dropped white bones onto a hyena hide mat, they clattered in strange patterns, spiraling outward before stopping with the lion tooth pointing at the child and the vulture bone stabbing at the comb. And Mamzithu's face darkened like a storm cloud, for the bones spoke of a cycle repeating, a curse half slept and half awakened. And she said only this: "She is not here to be healed, she is here to choose who will fade," before turning away and lighting 7 candles of animal fat to prepare for what must come. As the candles burned low, and the shadows stretched long across Mamzithu's hut, Gogo Wandel sat silently with the child pressed against her chest, her heartbeat loud and ragged beneath the thick folds of her shawl. And though the seer had spoken only a few words, their weight crushed her spirit like a boulder balanced on brittle bones. For what did it mean that the child would choose who would fade? And how could such power live in something so small, so silent, so newly formed? From dust and sorrow, Mamzithu moved slowly around the room, sweeping ash in wide arcs and murmuring to the ancestors in tones that no longer belonged to the living. And as the incense thickened and the hut grew warmer, the baby stirred and reached her tiny hand toward the dancing flames, not in fear but with a strange curiosity, as if remembering fire's taste on her skin. And that was when Gogo noticed the silence again, not the peaceful hush of newborns, or the reverent quiet of sacred spaces, but that same heavy, pulsing stillness that had hovered over the grave, over the river, and now clung to this moment like smoke to wet cloth. It was as if the child carried silence with her, not as a burden, but as her breath, her voice, her language. And Mamzithu, watching from behind veils of flame and smoke, finally spoke again, her voice brittle yet unshaken. The remembers her. It has followed her soul across lifetimes. That which Mancheba fed it still lingers. The girl is not the return, you are mistaken. She is the reckoning. These words echoed in Gogo's ears long after they left the hut, and though the sun had begun to rise, its light felt pale and uncertain as they descended the path back to the village, passing thorn trees that leaned away from them, and birds that refused to sing. Back in Umyuziwaki, the elders gathered beneath the council tree, their faces carved with suspicion and fear, for the news of the girl had traveled faster than wind, and already whispers of omens and broken taboos had taken root. And when Gogo stepped into the circle with the baby swaddled in faded cloth, the crowd parted not with welcome but with wariness, and Chief Zithaleli, his face lined like dry riverbeds, looked upon the child and then upon the rapt and asked, "Have we not buried this curse?" To which Gogo could only lower her eyes and whisper, "It has buried itself into her." And with that, the elders demanded a gathering of the diviners, a night of drums and invocation, to decide whether the child would remain among them or be carried into the wilderness as was done with those marked by unnatural things. And though Gogo clutched the baby tighter, her heart already knew the village had turned its face away, and the silence that clung to the girl would soon swallow. More than words, it would claim blood. The drums began at twilight, low and mournful like thunder buried beneath layers of earth, and as their echoes rolled through Umyuziwaki, every hearth fire was extinguished, every child brought inside, and every mouth silenced in reverence and fear. For the gathering of the bone diviners was not a ritual performed lightly at marked moments when fate stood at the village gates and waited to be let in or locked out. And tonight, that fate wore the form of a silent child wrapped in goat skin, her dark eyes absorbing firelight without blinking, her silence heavier than any word could ever be. Gogo Wandel stood on the edge of the sacred circle with the baby pressed close to her chest, her skin slick with sweat and dread, while the elders sat cross-legged on leopard skins, their faces painted with ash and river clay, their staffs crowned with feathers and teeth of beasts long vanished into legend. And in the center of them all sat Mamzithu, veiled in smoke, her hands hovering over the calabash that held ancestral water, drawn from the bottomless pool at Ntaba Yezethunzi, the mountain of shadows, known to mirror the truth of all things hidden. When she spoke, her voice rose like dust in dry wind. The girl walks with death, but she has not brought it yet. She is a question the ancestors have not answered. And with that, the drumming ceased, replaced by a strange stillness that made the night feel too wide, to watching. The was unwrapped before the circle and placed upon a woven mat, and as it touched the earth, the ground trembled faintly, as if remembering pain, and flames in the surrounding torches hissed and bowed inward, shrinking from the object's presence. One by one, the diviners cast bones, shells, and fragments of old relics into the circle, and each time they fell, they spiraled in strange patterns, never still, never yielding clarity, until the youngest among them, Nolwazi, barely 20, seasons old but already touched by dream sight, rose with tears in her eyes and said, "The child is not cursed alone. The curse lives in us, in all of Mancheba's seed. We have hidden from it, buried it, but it has not forgotten us. She is not the end, she is the mirror." And though her voice trembled, no one contradicted her, for deep inside, each descendant of Mancheba felt a knot tightening, a truth pulling free from the roots of their souls. Chief Zithaleli stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the baby who now watched him with eyes too ancient for her form. And after a long silence, he spoke. "She will not be cast out, not yet, but she cannot be raised in the village. Let the one who bore the mark before her raise her beyond the river's edge, in the place of the forgotten trees. If she is our mirror, let her grow far from our reflection. And with those words, judgment was passed not with hate, but with a dread respect. For they all knew the girl's silence was no longer empty, it was the sound of their own past, returning to watch. Long before the rooster's cry, before the mist had lifted from the thatched roofs of Uziwaki, Gogol Wandle began her silent journey beyond the river, carrying the child wrapped in layers of bark-dyed cloth and bound not only by warmth, but by fate itself. Her steps slow and deliberate as she passed the sleeping huts of those who once shared her laughter, but now avoided her shadow. No one stirred as she left, but eyes watched from behind reed curtains and mud-cracked doorways, the weight of their silence pressing against her back like a second burden. Yet she did not waver, for she had seen the truth in the diviners' bones. The child was neither curse nor salvation, but the fire that would reveal which was which. And so she walked without complaint, her heart whispering the names of those long dead, until the river's edge welcomed her with the hiss of morning waters and the rustle of reeds greeting a familiar ghost. The child slept deeply, untouched by the tension in the air, her hand curled tightly around a scrap of goat hide, Gogo's mother's cloth, worn smooth by generations and scented with ash, sweat, and herbs of remembrance sand as they crossed the river by the old wooden bridge, rotting yet stubborn. The trees on the other side shifted subtly, branches folding in as though to receive something sacred or secret. And here, beyond where children played and drums sang, lay the forgotten trees, a thicket where no one farmed, no huts were built, and even the wind passed through without song. For it was said the place remembered everything, even the things buried in silence. There, beneath the gnarled fig trees wrapped in vines thick as wrists, Gogo built a shelter of stone and earth, covering it in dry branches and smoked hide, her hands moving like those of the young girl she once was, hardened again by necessity. While birds called above in strange patterns, as if warning or welcoming, she named the child Zinzile, meaning she who remains. And though the girl still had not spoken a word, her eyes followed Gogo's every move with quiet intensity. And each night, as fire cracked low beneath a black sky full of unblinking stars, Gogo would tell her stories not with words, but with hums, with touch, with smoke patterns and whispered names drawn in dust. For she believed that even silence needed to remember where it came from. The she buried beneath the roots of the oldest tree, pressing it into the earth with hands trembling not from fear, but reverence, hoping the soil might cradle its hunger and muffle its memories. But even as the last grain of dirt fell into place, a chill slid across her spine, and far above, one star blinked and vanished, swallowed by the dark like a secret taken back by the sky. Seasons turned as they always did, with rains falling like drumming hands across the roof of Gogo Wandle's shelter, and sun slicing through the canopy of the forgotten trees like spears of flame, sent from ancestral realms. And in that hidden clearing where memory and silence grew thicker than roots, Zinzile thrived in her stillness, her limbs stretching like the branches above her, her eyes always open, always watching, though no word ever passed her lips and no cry ever escaped her throat, not even in hunger or pain. Gogo marked her growth not with milestones, but with changes in the air, the way wind paused before touching her skin, how the birds no longer sang near her, how even the shadows bent differently when she moved. And though no one from Uziwaki dared visit, strange offerings sometimes appeared at the edge of the woods, carved stones painted with ochre, bowls of fermented milk, feathers tied with braided hair, and once, a single goat's eye wrapped in banana leaf. left without tracks, as if the forest itself had delivered it. All signs that the villagers still remembered, still feared, and still whispered her name even if they never spoke it aloud. One night, as the fire burned low and Zinzal sat tracing her fingers through the dust in rhythmic circle, she had never been taught, Gogo noticed something in her pattern. A symbol older than the mountains, used only in the burial chants of Mancheba's lineage, and her heart clenched with dread. For how could the child know such marks unless memory had passed through the blood, like a spirit refusing to die? When Gogo asked in hushed breath, "Who taught you that?" the girl only looked up with those deep, ancient eyes and touched the earth gently, as if to say, "It was always here." And in that moment Gogo knew the comb's burial had not silenced its pull, only planted it deeper. That night, she dreamed of the fig tree under which it lay, the tree now grown taller, wider. Its bark cracked open like a mouth mid-scream, and within its roots, the throbbed faintly with a soft red light, pulsing like a heartbeat buried too long. She awoke with sweat chilling her back and found Zinzal already outside, standing barefoot before the tree, her fingers raised as if in prayer, the wind lifting her braids gently, not like a breeze but like breath. And for the first time, the birds were silent, not out of fear, but reverence. Gogo knew then that something had begun beneath the surface, not loud or sudden, but slow as rot, quiet as a curse remembering its name. And as the child turned to face her, the moonlight caught her eyes just right, revealing a shimmer that didn't belong to the living. The days that followed moved like mist clinging to wet ground, slow, heavy, and filled with whispers that never reached the ears. And though Zinzal had not spoken a word since her first breath, her silence had begun to shift, no longer empty, but layered with meaning, as if she were listening to something beneath the world's noise, something that called only to her. And Gogo Wandel began to notice other things. The way small creatures, duikers, mongooses, even a leopard once approached the clearing not with caution but with awe, pausing near Zinzal and bowing their heads as if recognizing her not as child, but as kin of something older. One morning, while grinding dried baobab fruit to paste, Gogo felt the wind thicken and heard a deep humming rise from beneath the soil. Not a sound made with throat or lips, but the kind that sits in the bones and grows louder with the heart's own rhythm. And she turned to find Zinzal standing once more before the fig tree, her arms stretched wide, eyes closed, her feet rooted in soil as though the earth had begun to claim her, yet she did not sink. Instead, the bark of the tree shifted slightly, revealing a narrow seam that hadn't been there before. And though Gogo cried out to her, voice shaking with both fear and awe, Zinzal did not move, did not blink, did not even breathe. Only when the seam sealed itself again did the child lower her arms and walk slowly back to the hut, her silence now sharp-edged, cutting through the air like a spear carved from stillness. That night, Gogo sat beside the fire with her old cowhide blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her knees aching with secrets she had buried deeper than any comb, and she whispered to the flames, "Mancheba, what did you trade, and what did you awaken in her?" But the fire gave no reply, only danced with shadows shaped like hands and mouths and eyes that blinked too slowly. In the distance, owls called in threes, a warning in the old ways. And Gogo knew that whatever slept beneath the fig tree was no longer dreaming, and whatever watched through Zinzal's eyes was not merely remembering, it was returning. The next morning, she found Zinzal drawing again, this time with charcoal on flat river stones, symbols that spiraled and knotted, marks of ancestral magic that hadn't been spoken since the era of red dust and bronze tongues. And when Gogo tried to lift one of the stones, It burned her palm not with fire, but with memory. Images of Mancheba combing her hair by moonlight, chanting to shadows that bent backward, drinking years from a mirror of bone, and laughing with lips that cracked with other people's youth. Gogo dropped the stone with a gasp, and Zinzal turned slowly to her, her face calm, her silence humming once more, not empty, not innocent, but ancient. On the 9th day after the tree revealed its seam, the rains returned, not with the wild joy of growing season, but with the slow sorrow of mourning, falling in long silver threads that turned the clearing to mud and blurred the edges of the world. Yet Zinzao remained untouched wherever she stood. The rain seemed to pause, curving around her body like a reluctant veil, and Gogol Wandel, though her bones ached and her soul grew heavier with each sunrise, knew she could no longer shield the child from what she was becoming, because the land itself had begun to listen to her, and the dead were stirring in the roots. That morning, as mist curled around the hut like old smoke, Gogo brought out the wooden chest she had buried when Zinzile was just bones and breath, a chest sealed with snake oil resin and charms carved by her great-grandmother, and within it lay relics she had vowed never to touch again: Mancheba's beaded sash, a copper ring that once belonged to a twin who had vanished without death rites, and a scroll of dried zebra skin covered in ink made from ant blood, bearing the forbidden names of the blood women, those who had walked the line between healing and hunger. Gogo laid each item before the fire and lit a stick of dried yucum root, the smoke spiraling upward in circles that trembled with unseen weight. And Zinzile, who had been sitting by the edge of the tree, rose and came to her without being called, her bare feet silent in the mud, her eyes reflecting the flicker of flame like water holding lightning. Gogo held up the copper ring and whispered, "This is where she began, child, the first trade, the first hunger." But Zinzile reached not for the ring, but for the scroll, and as her fingers brushed it, the ink shimmered, shifted, and began to crawl across the skin like ants returning to their nest, forming new symbols, unreadable yet somehow understood. And Gogo gasped, for she saw her own name emerge and fade, followed by a name she did not know, Dabakazi, a name that had not been spoken in her bloodline for 5 generations, the one they had erased when she was born with 2 shadows and a birthmark shaped like a closed eye. The scroll crumbled in Zinzel's hands, turning to dust that clung to her skin before vanishing into her pores. And when she looked up, there was no fear in her gaze, only stillness, like a lake moments before something breaks the surface. Thunder rolled above, though no lightning came, and the fig tree behind them creaked as if taking breath after a long sleep, its bark now pulsing faintly, as though matching the rhythm of Zinzel's own heart. And Gogo whispered, "She's not only remembering, she's being remembered." And with those words, she began to understand that this girl was not just the end of something cursed, she was the root from which it would grow again. That night, the wind changed its voice. It no longer whispered through the leaves like gossiping ancestors, but howled like an old woman keening at the edge of a burial pit. And Gogol Wandel, wrapped in the scent of yucum and sweat, sat motionless beside the cold embers of the fire while Zinzile walked alone beneath the wide arms of the fig tree, her movements dreamlike, deliberate, and far older than her 10 seasons on this earth. And the earth responded to her steps with murmurs too low for Gogo to understand, but they vibrated through her bones like the beat of a forgotten drum, stirring fears that had no shape, only shadow. Above them, the moon was shrouded by clouds the color of bruised flesh, and every now and then the fog would shift, revealing flashes of pale light that outlined Zinzel's silhouette, making her look less like a child and more like a spirit mid-journey, drawn to something beyond flesh or language. She stopped before the tree, and raised her arms again, not in praise but as if reaching for something hidden. And as her fingers opened, the tree began to bleed dark sap, seeping slowly from the same seam Gogo had seen in her dream, the bark splitting with a groan as the air filled with the scent of metal and ash. And from that open wound, something small and black dropped into Zinzel's waiting hands, a smooth stone comb, its teeth worn but sharp, its surface marked with old carvings so faint they looked like scars. And Gogo cried out, stumbling forward, her voice hoarse with a terror that cracked through her ribs. For she knew this was not the she had buried, it was older, deeper, something that had never been held by Mancheba or any woman after. And Zinzile held it like it belonged to her, her eyes distant as if she were listening to voices neither wind nor bird could carry. Gogo fell to her knees before the child and wept not from weakness, but from the terrible recognition that no one had given Zinzile her fate, that her silence had never been emptiness but the sound of something waking slowly, patiently, with the patience of roots that crack stone and curses that wait generations to speak again. As the rain began once more, soft and steady this time, the air filled with the faint hum of insects stirring, leaves trembling though no breeze touched them, and somewhere far off, deep in the belly of the forest, a drum began to beat, not struck by hand or stick, but echoing from within the land itself. And Gogo whispered, "The ground remembers her," while Zinzile pressed the against her chest, not combing her hair, but listening with it, as if it were not a tool but an ear, one tuned to the dead. At dawn, the began to hum not with sound, but with vibration, a soft throb that pulsed through Zinzel's fingers and into her blood. And with each beat, the air thickened, scented with ancient things, crushed marula bark, charred bone, rain, on old graves. And Gogol Wandel, now too afraid to approach her fully but too bound by love to turn away, watched from the doorway of the hut with red-rimmed eyes and a spine bent more by prophecy than age. Zinzile stood barefoot in the center of the clearing, unmoving, the clutched in one hand like a priestess holds a staff, and the fig tree behind her shivered though the wind had died, its leaves falling not in pairs, not in clusters, but one by one, slow and rhythmic, like a countdown spoken by something patient and cruel. And as the final leaf touched the ground, the earth gave a long, low moan, a sound that rose from deep beneath the roots, and out of the red soil came breath, not wind, but breath moist and human, as though the grave itself were exhaling. Zinzile tilted her head slightly and turned her eyes toward the western edge of the forest, where the sun barely reached, and where the path to Umuziwaki lay hidden among vines and thorns. And without a word, she began to walk, her steps pressing the mud into strange shapes, symbols that writhed before fading like dew beneath fire. And Gogo cried out, her voice breaking like clay in flame, "Zinzile, where are you going? Ntwan Ami?" But the girl did not turn, did not pause, only raised the slightly in answer, as though to say, "I am not going, I am returning." Gogo wrapped herself in her shawl of cowhide and prayer beads and followed at a distance, her old legs trembling beneath her, but her spirit held upright by dread. And as they passed deeper into the woods, the birds fell silent again, and even the insects stilled, for they too understood the sacred wrongness of a child walking with the steps of the dead. The sun rose high, and was swallowed by gray clouds that spiraled above them, and by midday, they reached the first of the ancestor stones, flat, wide markers carved centuries ago, half buried and forgotten by time, but now glowing faintly with red light as Zinzile passed them, the in her hand resonating with each one like a drum remembering its song. And when they reached the seventh stone, the one split cleanly down the middle by lightning many seasons past, Zinzile knelt and placed the gently in the crack, and for a heartbeat nothing moved, but then the crack began to widen, and a voice rose from within, old and cracked and layered with many tongues, all saying the same thing. Ndabakazi, daughter of silence, your mother's dead is still breathing. And Zinzile, still wordless, reached into the crack and pulled out not gold, not bones, but a bundle wrapped in skin, pulsing faintly like a newborn thing. Zinzile held the bundle with both hands, its surface damp and veined like it had been torn from something still alive. And as she rose to her feet, the humming from the ceased, replaced by a deep silence that pressed against Gogol Wandle's ears like the pressure before a storm breaks thick, expectant, trembling with hidden edges. The bundle was light, yet pulsing, as if a second heartbeat had been added to Zinzel's own. And the child did not flinch, did not ask questions, only turned back toward the way they had come. Her eyes darker now, rimmed with a strange silver shimmer that was not tears but something older, something that had watched stars fall and forests rot. Gogo stumbled after her, every step a battle between terror and the old, buried duty she had once promised the river gods she would never be called upon to fulfill again. And as they passed beneath the ancestor stones once more, their red glow faded, replaced by small black moths that fluttered upward from the ground, silent and unburning, gathering in the trees like watching eyes. Back in the clearing, the fig tree had shed all its leaves and now stood naked and steaming, its bark wet with sap that smelled of burnt hair and honey, and Zinzile knelt beneath it, setting the bundle down on a bed of dry palm fronds as the comb, now pale as bone, floated gently from her hand and lodged itself upright in the soil. Like a marker at the head of a grave, Gogo approached slowly, her knees buckling beneath her shawl, and when she looked upon the bundle, it began to unravel on its own, the skin peeling back like petals, revealing not a body, but a mirror made of obsidian, cracked in 3 places, its surface rippling not with her reflection but with scenes from another life. First Muncheba, young and radiant, combing her thick hair before a woven mat, her eyes full of desire not for beauty, but for time itself. Then another woman, eyes hollow, sitting in a hut surrounded by dolls made of bones and ash. And finally, a child crying, in the dark, hands reaching for a mother who no longer remembered her name. Each image flared and faded, leaving behind the sound of breathing that did not belong to either of them. Gogo's heart seized as she realized the mirror was showing not memories but deaths, and the crack in the center throbbed with a voice that was neither male nor female, saying softly, "Every has teeth, and every tooth remembers the mouth it fed." And Zinzile, her face unreadable, touched the crack with her fingers, and the mirror screamed a sound without sound, a shiver that ran through the earth, up the tree, and into the sky, where clouds split open to reveal not sun, but a great black eye blinking slowly above them, lidless and unkind, watching what had finally been returned. The black eye in the sky blinked once more, and with its movement, the wind returned not as breeze, but as a roar that sent dust spiraling from the earth in twisted patterns, like the dancing skirts of possessed sangomas. And the air around Zinzile thickened with the scent of forgotten herbs, of bile, of blood that had never dried. And the fig tree groaned louder than ever, its branches bending inward as if trying to shield itself from what it had summoned. The obsidian mirror at her feet vibrated violently, the cracks widening until they became rivers of shadow leaking smoke into the air. And in that smoke, the outlines of faces formed hundreds, maybe thousands, some weeping, others laughing, with mouths full of teeth but no eyes, each one whispering in fragments of old dialects, some lost before the first hut was built in Zimkalu. And Gogo Wandle fell backward, covering her ears, though the voices were not truly sound. They were memory forced into breath, into marrow, and her bones shook with every echo. Zinzile did not flinch, only stared into the mirror with the unblinking patience of something no longer entirely human. And the shadows curled around her, coiling up her legs, wrapping her shoulders like serpents of smoke. Yet she stood calm, her arms lifting as if offering herself not in surrender but in recognition. And in that moment, the ground beneath the fig tree split open, revealing not roots but a staircase of bones descending into utter blackness, as if the grave had finally widened its mouth to call its daughter home. The mirror shattered with a shriek, sending fragments into the air where they floated instead of falling, each shard reflecting a different age. Zinzile as a baby in a grave, Zinzile walking through fire untouched, Zinzile grown and crowned in thorns, each future a curse and a coronation. Gogo, crawling toward her with tears streaming down her face, begged her in broken breath not to take the step, not to vanish into the place where no names returned. But Zinzile turned slowly, her face soft now, mournful, as if understanding that love and fear were the same when offered by those too old to change their fate. And she reached out to Gogo, not with pity, but with blessing, touching her forehead with the ash-covered tip of one finger. And as her skin met Gogo's, the old woman gasped and saw the origin of the comb, the first woman who had carved it from a god's tooth, the ritual that demanded her daughter's youth in exchange for victory in war, the generations that had unknowingly fed it with stolen years. And Gogo screamed not in pain but in understanding, knowing now that Zinzile was not cursed, but chosen, not punished, but returned. And as Zinzile stepped down into the earth's open throat, the staircase closed behind her, the black eye above vanishing with a slow blink, leaving behind only the soft rustle of feathers and the smell of wet stone and memory. Beneath the earth, Zinzile moved through a corridor not carved by hands, but by time and sorrow, a narrow passage where the walls breathed and pulsed like muscle, slick with ancestral sweat, etched with symbols that glowed dimly in ochre and ash as she passed. And each step she took sent out a vibration that stirred the bones embedded in the ceiling bones of children and mothers, warriors and witches, all those who had borne the price of the comb's hunger. The deeper she went, the warmer the air grew, heavy with the musk of old rituals, of sacrifices done under moons long swallowed by night. And at the end of the corridor, the space opened into a vast chamber where fire burned without flame and shadows moved without light. And there sat the Council of Mavambo, the original ones, 7 figures carved from stone and spirit, faces featureless but somehow full of judgment, seated in a circle around a bowl filled not with water, but with silence itself, thick and trembling like sap from a cursed baobab. Zinzile stood before them barefoot, the earth below her pulsing in rhythm with her heart. And though she had never been taught their language, she understood them, for they spoke in the memory of all living things, their voices not spoken but remembered, and they asked not who she was, but why she had returned, why she bore the touch of the tooth that had once fed on her lineage like a leech, why she had not been consumed like the others. She answered not with words but by kneeling and placing her hands upon the silence bowl, and the moment her skin touched it, the silence burst outward into sound, 1,000 screams locked in time, each a child robbed of youth, each a woman, hollowed by a natural age. And the chamber filled with the echo of stolen lives until the stones themselves wept red tears. The council absorbed the cries, growing taller with each one, until the chamber darkened, and from the ceiling dropped a vine of hair long, black, braided and tangled with thorns, still alive, still moving, and it wrapped itself around Zinzile's arms, not to bind, but to connect, to feed, to measure. The council hummed, and their leader, the tallest among them, pointed a stone finger at her chest, where her heartbeat now thudded in rhythm with something beneath the chamber, something ancient and hungry. You are the key, the thought entered her like a flood. You are the debt made flesh. You may ascend, but the cost must follow. And then the ground beneath her rose, lifting her slowly through the earth like a reversed burial. And the soil that once swallowed her now gave birth again. And she emerged not beneath the fig tree, but in the heart of the village of Emgedi, surrounded by stunned villagers whose eyes widened as they saw her cloaked in dust and blood, and braided shadow, with silence walking beside her like an unseen beast. The villagers of Emgedi stood frozen like termite mounds at dusk, their eyes wide and mouths agape as Zinzile stepped from the soil, her limbs coated in clinging earth, the braid of thorns still wrapped around her shoulders like the regalia of some long-forgotten queen of morning, and none dared speak her name, not even Noma, the potmaker's daughter who once played beside the burial fields, and swore she saw a girl rise from a shallow grave, nor old Makulu Tembo, whose blind eyes wept suddenly though they had seen nothing in 30 seasons. Zinzel's presence drew a trembling hush over the compound, the chickens falling still, the goats backing into their pens as if remembering a time when names had power, and silence had teeth. And the dust that clung to her did not fall but shimmered, with the faint pulse of ancestral spirits, whispering around her feet like wind in a dry forest. She walked slowly, her bare soles kissing the red earth, her eyes scanning faces that recoiled from her gaze yet could not look away. And from every thatched roof and weathered veranda, elders peeked with trembling fingers at their chests, tracing old sigils with trembling hands, whispering prayers meant for burial rites. Gogol Wandel, having crawled her way back to the village behind Zinzile, now knelt at the edge of the gathering, her breath thin and hands shaking from visions she could not explain. And when she tried to call out to warn the others, her voice failed her. The silence that followed Zinzile now lived in Gogo's throat. Then came Boob Bessie, the warrior son of the river people, stepping forward in defiance, his spear tipped with obsidian and his chest painted with the ash of ancestors. And he raised his weapon with a trembling challenge, demanding to know whether she was spirit or girl, prophet or curse. But Zinzile did not speak. Instead, she raised her hand slowly, and with it, the braid on her shoulders unraveled, falling to the ground and twisting of its own will, rising again as a serpent made of hair and thorn, its eyes gleaming with the reflection of stolen time. And before Boob Bessie could strike, the creature coiled around his spear and turned it to dust. The people gasped as one, and the village itself seemed to groan, the earth beneath them vibrating like the throat of a drum. And from the far end of the compound, the ancestors' mask kept in the shrine for generations fell from its hook and shattered upon the ground, its pieces curling with smoke. The omens were too many now, and even the boldest among them stepped back, for they knew what walked among them was not merely a child returned from the earth, but a reckoning long delayed. And as Zinzile looked toward the mountain that rose beyond the horizon, where they had first drawn blood centuries ago, her path was clear, and all who saw her that day remembered her not as the girl born in a grave, but as the silence that chose to walk. The path to the mountain of Ntaba Kalalaza was not one of dust and stone alone. It was layered with echoes, every footprint Zinzile made pressing into centuries of blood once spilled to protect the secret, buried at its peak. And as she moved through the forest that skirted its base, the trees bowed subtly, their leaves whispering in tones no living man could hear, their roots recoiling from the braid of thorns that now crawled behind her like a shadow that fed on memory. Birds grew quiet as she passed, their songs swallowed by the silent hum of ancestral warning. And somewhere in the canopy, A monkey shrieked and fled, dropping a half-eaten marula fruit that rolled to Zinzel's feet and cracked into its white flesh, darkening instantly as if spoiled by her presence. Yet she was not deterred. Her eyes locked on the mountain ahead, whose peak was shrouded by a black mist that twisted upward like incense from a sacred wound. And the wind that came down its slopes carried the bitter scent of old curses, of rituals performed without consent, of girls traded to gods with hollow promises of rain. Near a stream that cut through the underbrush like a silver snake, she paused and knelt, dipping her fingers into the water, and as the liquid touched her skin, it boiled not from heat but from rejection, the river recognizing her as one who did not belong among the living or the dead, but in a space between. A low growl came from the opposite bank, and there stood Naka, the leopard of the old stories, for black as night and eyes glowing with green fire, its breath curling like steam as it stepped forward, each paw print blooming with crimson flowers. That wilted instantly, and Zinzao rose to meet its gaze, unafraid. For the beast was not a guardian but a memory, the first to bear witness when there was born from bone. Its roar the last sound heard by the girl who carved it. It bowed its head and turned, leading her along the hidden path that rose up the side of Mtaba Kalalaza like a scar. And she followed, her bare feet leaving no mark, though the soil beneath her wept with each step. For the mountain remembered her bloodline, and in that memory was fear. Thunder cracked across the sky though no storm gathered, and in the heart of the mountain something stirred, old bones clicking in readiness, the humming faintly from where it waited in its burial cave, eager to feed again. But this time its daughter came not in ignorance, but in reckoning, and the mountain held its breath as the path narrowed and climbed higher into the throat of Mtaba Kalalaza. The air thickened with a stillness that pressed against Zinzel's skin like invisible fingers, and the cries of distant animals faded until even her own breath felt foreign, echoing in her chest like wind trapped in a calabash. The black leopard Naka vanished without sound into the mist, leaving her before a jagged stone arch crowned with bones and feathered talismans, some fresh, some brittle with age, each swaying gently though no breeze moved. And she knew she had arrived at the gate of mouthless elders, where voices were stolen and truths were buried. The air buzzed low with a pulse that didn't come from the earth but from something older, deeper. And the moment she stepped through the arch, her vision blurred, and the world twisted sideways as if the mountain turned its face to look directly at her, displeased by her return. The cave walls ahead of her bled a black ichor that smoked as it touched the ground, and the silence inside was absolute, not empty, but saturated with listening, like 1,000 unseen eyes watched through stone and root, waiting for her to speak and fail. For in this sacred place, lies were not tolerated and fear had no shadow to hide beneath. The braid of thorns slithered forward ahead of her, sensing the path, and every time it touched the stone, a burst of ancestral wailing filled the space for a breath and vanished, as if warning her with each step that the remembered everything, every scream, every wrinkle etched prematurely, every unborn child stolen by its hunger. Soon she reached a chamber where 7 clay statues stood in a circle, each cloaked in woven hair and painted with sigils from the first tongue. And in the center of them sat on a raised slab of stone, glistening with oil though no hand had touched it in generations, its teeth long and sharp, carved from the thigh bones of the sacrificed, each tooth humming with life and vengeance. Zinzal stepped forward, and the instant her eyes locked with the comb, a pain gripped her chest, not of injury but remembrance, as if that was forcing her to relive every moment it had consumed. And suddenly she saw her mother's cracked lips, as they aged before her eyes, her grandmother's screams in the fire, the hollow gaze of children with gray in their hair, and through it all, the face of the girl who first forged the comb, whose name had been struck from memory by the elders. Out of fear, her mouth sewn shut with wire, her eyes replaced with obsidian stones, Zinzile trembled but did not fall, and as she reached toward the comb, the chamber grew cold, and the statues around her began to weep blood from their painted eyes. The mountain shaking slightly in resistance, for what she was about to do had never been done, and the cost would rewrite her bones.